Hello, everyone. Today we have Peter from Tank Archives as a guest, and he is about to publish his first book on a T-34, namely Designing T-34, the Genesis of the Revolutionary Soviet Tank. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
And you're probably going to ask, well, why another book on the T-34? Peter works a lot with primary sources, and as we mentioned in a previous video, there's a lot of problems usually with T-34 information in Western books and older books. So he looked more at the primary sources so he can better reproduce what is correct and incorrect. And since, to a certain degree, the origin of the T-34 goes a bit back to the Spanish Civil War, we today will talk about how the Spanish Civil War influenced Soviet tank design.
Yep. So, as we mentioned in the last video, there's a bit of a myth that the T-34 was built. The requirements were composed as a result of the clashes with the Japanese at Lake Hassan and Halkan Gol. That's entirely incorrect. These requirements go all the way back to the Spanish Civil War. But I would actually like to start a little bit earlier than that in the Russian Civil War. So the Red Army did not really have much tank experience. There were to capture tanks that were used. These tanks were given to the whites by the French and the British. These tanks were captured. The the RSFSR at that point did actually start building their own tanks, but they were not completed by the end of the war. So the only real experience until the Spanish Civil War that they had was battle against Chinese warlords in the defending the Chinese Eastern Railroad. You can kind of guess that these battles were not very tasking on the vehicles, and the requirements developed were very, let's say, by World War II standards, were very weak. So these tanks would have to be protected from low velocity 37 and 47 millimeter guns from very long range. So think the British 3-pounder, the French SA-18. So these were not really anti-tank guns. Heavy tanks, so the T-30, T-28, and T-35 would have a whopping 30 millimeters of armor, protect them against these guns from 500 meters, and light tanks would even have bulletproof armor. So these, in absence of kind of conflicts, peer conflicts, as they would say today, these tanks, the design stagnated. So generation after generation of tanks, they would have really the same requirements.
How much influence was there from the German Soviet cooperation at the tank school at Kazan?
So there's quite a bit. One of the most noticeable things, if you look at the BT2 and the MS1, you will see that the machine gun and the main cannon are mounted separately. And the T-26s, the old earlier ones with two turrets, there's one with a 37 millimeter cannon, there's one with a machine gun. One of the most notable things that was taken from the German designs was the coaxial mount. So around 1933, you start seeing Soviet tanks coming out with cannon and a machine gun paired up, which made the turrets a lot easier to kind of, the layout was a lot more reasonable. There was more space on the inside. So I would say that's one of the most influential things that the Soviets took from German designs. The suspension of the T-28 actually was, depending on who you ask, was either entirely copied from the Gross tractor or inspired by the Gross tractor. But yeah, there's absolutely no shame about seeing something that worked and copying it or improving upon it, or something like that. Where people these days will say, "Oh, it's the Soviets copied the AK and from the Sturmgewehr and they covered it up. It was conspiracy." But there was absolutely no shame in saying, yes, I copied this from a foreign
Yeah.
source.
I mean, there's basically this quote about tactics in the First World War about the cross-fertilization of tactics and everything. So they learn from each other. I mean, the Panzer I, I think, was basically the suspension. Everything was a copy of a British tank, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was a Vickers
Yeah.
tractor, so it's kind of interesting to look at because the Soviets very openly copied from Vickers. So the T-26, obviously, the T-37 was a further evolution of a Vickers design. You can tell by looking at the suspension. The Vickers Mark IV periscope, the Gunlock scope, was also copied eventually. and it was still called the MK4. So there's no concealment about where or what the source was of all of these solutions. So the war begins. As you all know, the USSR supported Republicans. Italy supported the nationalists. The USSR smuggled a bunch of T-26 tanks into Spain, armored cars as well, and to see to help out, but they also sent a lot of attachés to see how these tanks fare. Now, it turns out that in the last 5 years, the battlefield has kind of changed. Now there are a lot more weapons dangerous to tanks. So there's high caliber machine guns, 13 millimeter, 12.7 millimeter. There's armor piercing bullets for rifle caliber machine guns as well. There are now high velocity 37 millimeter guns, so like the Bofors gun, the German 3.7 centimeter pack, and previously when the Red Army was engaging either the whites, the interventionist forces, Chinese warlords, that were fighting in the open steppe most of the time. Now tanks have to fight in cities. Tanks are vulnerable, extremely vulnerable in the cities, especially if you're infantry. And a lot of the infantry was not very well trained. They weren't very highly motivated. So whenever there's some machine gun fire or something sketchy, they just fall back and leave the tank unprotected. And then the tank is vulnerable to Molotov cocktails thrown from above. It's vulnerable. It can get stuck on barricades. It's easy to trap a tank and destroy it once it's been immobilized. One other very interesting thing that they found out was that tanks would often run out of HE ammunition when firing at pillboxes or barricades, and they would actually. There have been numerous reports that I read about T-26 tanks firing armor-piercing ammunition at machine gun nests because that's all they had left. And credit to the T-26's ability, they would actually hit these machine gun nests and knock them out. But it was more difficult to do, obviously, than with HE, and it was less effective. So as a result, the Soviet intervention in the war, I believe, lasted until 1938. But even in mid of 1937, they came up with some conclusions about what the tank of the future should look like. One of the requirements was obviously protection from more powerful anti-tank guns. So this, instead of the 37 millimeter gun, they thought, we don't have any of those to test with. The requirement was protection from 45 millimeter guns from 1,000 meters. So typically, the Soviet ballpark was that a tank should be protected from its own gun at the range of 1,000 meters. Since Soviet tanks had 45 millimeter guns at that point, chiefly, then that was the requirement. A 76 millimeter gun had to be available for field fortifications, and you could see some experiments with the BT-7 artillery tank, with the T-26-4, trying to fit this 76 millimeter gun into a two-man turret. Proved quite complicated.
I can imagine.
Yeah, some of these requirements were quite unusual. So, for example, the tank hull had to be modified for ramming. So you need to be able to ram through barricades. And there's a division commander who, not the highest sort of rank, but still had some ideas about requirements. He actually wanted a powered chainsaw to come out of the front of the tank and cut through any barricades. Yeah, his requirements were not implemented. But another interesting requirement was a requirement for very, very high gun elevation. So the cannon would have to go up to 60 to 70 degrees.
Wow.
So very high up. A machine gun, a rifle caliber AA machine gun would have to be able to go up to 85 degrees. So these tanks would have to be able to fire almost directly upwards.
Was this due to the mountainous terrain they faced in Spain to a certain degree, or urban fighting, or
It
both?
it was the urban fighting. I haven't seen mountainous terrain mentioned in when these requirements are being discussed, but I assume the mountains also had some effect. So the tank would, not only have to fire forwards but also backwards. So the back of the tank must be protected with a flamethrower or a machine gun. And you see up to the IS-2 where there's a machine gun sticking out the back of the turret covering essentially the engine deck. That was a requirement that persisted all the way from the Spanish Civil War.
Ah.
Yeah, and this was something that also came up during the conflict with Japan, is that they would say that would actually say samurai are climbing on our tanks, and they actually did use the term samurai, and we don't necessarily, necessarily there isn't like a friendly tank that could see this happening that could sweep them off of you. It needs to be a machine gun pointing backwards, or a flamethrower. And if you look at early A20 blueprints, which I actually have in my book, courtesy of Alexei Makarov from his personal collection, the T20, sorry, the A20 turret has a gun that elevates to 70 degrees and a machine gun out the back. And I'm surprised they had any room left in the turret for anything else, including the crew, because yeah, these are very bulky objects. There's also a requirement to slope the armor. So this is why you start seeing the BT7, BD7M, the T26 model, the 1939 production model, sloped turret platform, sloped turret. You start seeing, well, there was a handful of even T35s built with sloped turrets. But the real requirement was for these heavy tanks, they would need to have between 30 and 70 millimeters of armor. Even simple calculations showed that a T35 with 70 millimeters of armor would not be able to drive anywhere. So that's where the KV came from. So interestingly enough, they did describe the dream tank, right? A lot of these requirements were phrased in the way of, let's take the most promising tanks at the time were the BT7 ISB, which had the multiple powered road wheels. That's eventually what became the BT7M, and the T46-1, I believe, which proved to be way too expensive to replace the T26. So all of these changes had to be made to these existing tanks. But the dream tank, that the ideal tank, was a fully tracked tank. It would weigh between 25 and 30 tons. It would have 40 to 50 millimeters of sloped armor, and it would be armed with a 45 or 76 millimeter gun. Now, these requirements were composed in 1937, but if you look at the T-34, it matches them exactly. So there are all these myths about Koshkin or other designers or engineers kind of putting their own initiative and making up this tank under penalty of execution. They were working on it illegally, but these requirements have been there since 1937. So it's not really something that they came up with. It's something that the army came up with and was very much behind the entire time.
Okay, and in terms of heavy tanks, were there any major conclusions or other experiences?
So there weren't any heavy tanks sent into Spain, and I'm including the T-28 into the heavy tank category. They were very way too large to kind of to ship, especially if you're trying to avoid blockades. But based on the data obtained about foreign guns, that's where the 30 to 70 millimeter of armor requirement came from. They started working on heavy tanks from a purely theoretical basis. Heavy tanks would not see battle until the Winter War, when the three prototypes, the SMK, the T100, the KV, would be sent to the battlefield to fight. There's a lot of misremembered kind of rumors saying, well, the T46 was sent to Finland, the T34 was sent to Finland. That was not the case. It was only these three tanks, the heavies, were tried out.
One final trivia question. The Germans noted, of course, that their tanks, when they smuggled them into Spain, were tractors, and the crew members were tourists, and their officers were called tourist guides. Was there something similar for the Soviets?
So there were officially, it was discouraged. It was illegal to cross the border and go to Spain and fight there. And I'm pretty sure there were some impressionable young pioneers who would have tried to do that anyway, even though the government was very much there doing this. So in internal documents, they are described as attaches and commanders. So there wasn't, once you get past a certain level of classification, there wasn't any kind of attempt to hide it.
So they were attaches and not okay, because agricultural equipment and tourists are basically a running joke. So the Soviets were less funny in their what they came up to sneak in their man.
Yes, and unfortunately, humor is not the Red Army's strong suit. Although there are some interesting notes written in pencil on the margins of documents that sometimes contain very unprintable language, as the press would put it.
Yeah, I've seen a few in the German archives myself. The main problem is I can't usually read their old handwriting,
Hmm.
but in some cases it's quite hilarious what they put there, and with the different colored pen, like everyone else is writing something over there.
Yeah, Stalin had a trademark red pencil, and he would write. I have it on my blog. It's a report by a reliable source. You know, the Germans are mounting up to attack. I think it was written on June 20th or something like that, in 1941. And Stalin wrote, quite a number of profanities in the address of this so-called reliable source. This guy is provocateur, ignored everything he says, and some very harsh words about his mother.
Okay.
So yeah, sometimes these things were taken very personally. And if you're Stalin, you can afford
Yeah,
to do
you
that.
can do pretty much everything. Yeah. Okay. Well, is there something to add about the Spanish Civil War and Zavatank define?
Well, I mean, I mentioned that the machine gun ended up surviving the um, kind of the test of time until it was removed after the IS-2 was in production. A lot of these other requirements actually did not survive. So the high gun elevation, the T-34 had a gun elevation of 30 degrees, not 60 or 70 degrees. So a lot of these things were, they did try it. It turns out there was a lot of issue with the recoil buffers, and it was not really worth it if you had the proper tactics. So if you see street fighting manuals that were issued around fighting for Berlin, it was simpler to just have tanks drive on the opposite side of the street and pointing their guns at the opposite the opposite building, rather than have this kind of 70-degree elevation mechanism. That would be very complicated, very difficult to service. But yeah, things like sealing your tank against Molotov cocktails, having some kind of way to protect yourself at close range, emphasis on cooperation between infantry and tanks. These were all lessons that were learned from the Spanish Civil War. Unfortunately, the Winter War came too soon for them to really take traction. And even in the early days of the Great Patriotic War, a lot of these lessons were not put into action.
Yeah, that's quite often if the training or something lags behind. Anyway, if you like what you heard, be sure to check out Peter's book. It's linked in the description, and I will also put it in the comments. So, and thank you very much, Peter, for taking time for the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening, and see you next time. Bye.
Goodbye.